George Freeman stood alone on the deck of the massive ocean liner Liberté, leaning against the railing as the salty wind whipped through his coat. Behind him, the silhouette of New York City faded into the early morning mist. He watched it slowly disappear, a part of him aching, another part relieved. His hands, calloused from years of holding a saxophone, tightened on the cold metal. He took a deep breath and let the ocean air fill his lungs. It didn't taste like New York. It tasted like something else, something uncertain. In his small cabin below deck sat a battered leather suitcase. Inside it were 2 pairs of worn shoes, 3 carefully folded shirts, a notebook filled with scribbled melodies, and 1 silver tenor saxophone, the only thing in his life that had never let him down. America had done what it always did. It had taken his talent, his passion, and his soul, and reminded him every single day that no matter how hard he played, he would never be more than a black man trying to break into white spaces. Harlem had loved him. The people had cheered for him in smoky basement clubs. But beyond those walls, beyond his own kind, the city had spit him out time after time. He'd had enough. The stories about Paris had reached his ears over the years like a distant melody, too good to believe, yet impossible to ignore. Musicians spoke of freedom there, of audiences who didn't care about the color of your skin, only the sound of your soul. American artists had gone before him, singers, painters, writers, each one returning with wild stories of respect, opportunity, and something he hadn't felt in years: dignity. So George saved every dollar he could. He played every cheap gig that paid in coins or half-finished drinks. He ate less, worked more, and finally bought himself a one-way ticket across the Atlantic. He told no one, not even the few friends he had left. He was done explaining himself. The journey took 7 days, 7 long days of endless waves, cold nights, and cheap food served by men who barely noticed he existed. George kept mostly to himself, stepping out onto the deck only when the air in his cabin became too thick to breathe. He spent hours staring at the sea, wondering if he had made the biggest mistake of his life. But when the ship finally pulled into Le Havre and he boarded the small train that rattled toward Paris, something inside him stirred, something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The city greeted him with noise. Not the sharp electric noise of New York, but something softer, messier. The clatter of footsteps on cobblestone streets, the hum of conversation in languages he didn't yet understand, the distant echo of an accordion playing somewhere nearby. Paris didn't rise like a wall of glass and steel. It unfolded in layers, stone buildings leaning together like old friends, narrow alleys winding into open squares filled with tiny tables and chairs. George stepped out of the taxi that had dropped him in Montmartre, clutching his suitcase in one hand, his saxophone case in the other. He stood for a moment, letting the city breathe around him. He wasn't sure where to go next. The address he carried had come from a friend, an old woman who supposedly rented out rooms to artists. He walked up the hill, the pavement slick with rain, until he found a small cafe with peeling green paint and a faded sign that read Café des Artistes. Above it, an open window revealed a flickering light. George pushed open the cafe door. The smell of coffee, wine, and cigarette smoke wrapped around him like an old coat. A woman stood behind the counter, wiping glasses with a slow, steady rhythm. She was older, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun, her eyes sharp but not unkind. Bonsoir, she greeted him in French. George cleared his throat. Bonsoir. I'm looking for Madame Lefebvre. The woman raised an eyebrow. You found her. Who sent you? Paul, from New York, George replied carefully. He said you might have a room. Madame Lefebvre studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward the stairs at the back of the cafe. 20 francs a week, cash only. You cook for yourself. No noise after midnight. Understood? George nodded. Understood. The room was small, just a bed, a chipped wooden table, and a window that barely shut, but it was his. For the first time in months, he felt like he could finally exhale. He didn't waste time. Paris wasn't going to wait for him to find his footing. The next night, he wandered the streets of the left bank, following the faint sound of music until he found a tiny club with red curtains and no name on the door. Inside, a trio of musicians was playing a slow, smoky tune. The air was thick with conversation and laughter. George didn't ask for permission. He waited until the set ended, then approached the bandstand, saxophone in hand. "You mind if I sit in?" he asked the trumpet player, who glanced at him with mild curiosity. The man nodded slowly. "If you can keep up." George smiled. "Try me." And when he played that night, the room changed. Heads turned, glasses paused mid-air. The melody poured from his horn like something alive, filling every corner of the small club. When the last note hung in the air, the crowd erupted in applause. It was the first time in a long time that George didn't feel like he was performing for approval. He felt like he was belonging to something bigger than himself. Over the next few days, word started to spread. A name passed from mouth to mouth. George Freeman, the American saxophonist who played like fire and smoke wrapped in silver. And Paris, for a fleeting moment, felt like a city ready to embrace him. But standing in the back of that same club, just beyond the applause, were two French musicians leaning against the bar, whispering to each other in voices too low for George to hear. They didn't smile, they didn't clap. George noticed them, and for the first time since he had arrived, a chill crept back into his bones. George's name started appearing on posters quicker than he expected. At first, it was small venues, tiny cafes on the left bank, dimly lit bars in Montmartre. But every night, more people showed up. Word of mouth traveled faster than any manager or promoter ever could. "You have to hear the American," they whispered. "He plays like no one else." And George was alive again. It started to feel like New York had never happened. The tightness in his chest loosened every time he stepped on stage. He played freely here, not trying to fit into someone else's mold, not holding back, worried about who might be watching. He played like Paris was his last chance to be the man he always knew he could be. One night, after a fiery set at a small club near the Seine, a well-dressed man approached him while George packed up his saxophone. The man wore a tailored gray suit and a burgundy scarf loosely tied around his neck. He carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from being someone people listened to. "Bonsoir," the man greeted, offering his hand. "You're George Freeman, oui?" "That's me," George replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Pierre Lemaitre." The man introduced himself with a practiced smile. "I represent Le Chat Noir. I'm sure you've heard of it?" Of course George had heard of Le Chat Noir. Every musician in Paris had. It was the most famous jazz club in the city, the place where legends played, where critics gathered, where careers were made or broken. Pierre leaned in slightly. "We have an opening next Friday. I think you're ready for it." George felt his throat tighten. "Just like that?" Pierre shrugged as if it were nothing. "Your name's already making noise. I'd rather catch you now before someone else does." George nodded slowly. "I'll be there." That week felt like it stretched for a year. George practiced more than he had in months. He played every note twice, 3 times, until his fingers ached and his lips went numb. This was more than a gig. This was a door into the part of Paris that only let a chosen few step through. Friday night came like a storm. Le Chat Noir stood on a narrow street in the heart of the city. Its black and gold sign glowed softly under the street lamps. The line to get in stretched down the block. George had to push through the crowd just to reach the side entrance. Backstage, he paced like a man waiting for a verdict. The club was packed. He could hear the hum of the crowd through the walls, the soft clinking of glasses, the buzz of anticipation. When his name was called, he stepped onto the stage, squinting into the lights, and then silence. Hundreds of eyes fixed on him. He raised his saxophone and he played. It started slow, like a whisper, a soft, winding melody that curled around the room, pulling everyone in closer. Then he built it, layer by layer, adding fire to every note, letting the music swell and crack open like lightning across a summer sky. George played like the city had never seen him before, like he had nothing left to lose. When the final note echoed through the air, the silence was thick. For one terrifying second, George thought he had failed. Then the room exploded. The applause hit him like a wave. People stood, shouting his name. Strangers pounded their hands on tables. The energy felt alive, electric. It ran through his veins like fire. Pierre met him off stage, his face lit with something close to pride. "You see?" Pierre said, clapping a hand on George's shoulder. "You were born for this stage." Over the next few weeks, George's life blurred into something that felt too good to be real. Every night, a new club. Every morning, a new headline. The American saxophone sensation takes Paris by storm. George Freeman, the new king of jazz in the City of Light. He was invited to parties with artists, poets, and actors. Women leaned in close, asking him to play just one more song. Journalists begged for interviews. Pierre managed his schedule like a man running a machine. "You'll burn bright here, George," Pierre told him over glasses of wine in a crowded cafe. "But you have to keep feeding the fire." And George believed it. He believed every word, until the smile started to feel a little too forced, until the laughter sounded just a bit too sharp, until the same two French musicians he had seen that first night at the tiny club began showing up again, always standing at the back, always watching, never clapping. George tried to ignore them, but one night their whispers grew loud enough for him to catch. "Of course they love him," one of them muttered in French. "Americans always take more than they give. He'll disappear soon enough." George's fingers curled tightly around his glass. He didn't turn around, didn't confront them. But the words sat in his chest like a stone. For the first time since arriving in Paris, he wondered if the city was clapping for his music, or clapping for the chance to watch him fall. George tried to shake it off. After all, they were just words, whispers spoken by jealous men standing in dark corners. Told himself it didn't matter. The audience still cheered. The clubs still called. The city still opened its arms to him every night. But deep down, the seed had already been planted. The first real crack appeared a week later. George had just finished a 2-hour set at a small venue in the Marais district. The club had been packed from wall to wall. Strangers had pressed in close, hanging on every note. It had been one of those rare nights when the music carried him so completely he almost forgotten where he was. Almost. He was packing up his saxophone when the owner of the club approached him. A heavy-set man with round glasses and a nervous smile. He shifted awkwardly, clearing his throat before speaking. "George, can I speak to you for a moment?" George nodded, slipping his horn back into its case. "Sure, what's up?" The owner glanced around as if making sure no one was listening. He leaned in close, dropping his voice. "Listen, some of the local players, they've been saying you're difficult to work with. That you take over the stage, make it all about you." George blinked. "What? Who told you that?" The owner raised his hands. "I'm not saying I believe it. I just thought you should know. Word travels fast in this city. People are talking." George swallowed the lump rising in his throat. "I've never taken anything that wasn't given to me. You know that." The man sighed. "I do. But sometimes it doesn't matter what's true. It matters what people believe." The next day, George heard another rumor. This time it came from a young trumpet player he had met a few weeks earlier. The kid approached him outside Le Chat Noir, glancing nervously over his shoulder before speaking. "They're saying you stole someone's arrangement," the kid whispered. "A French composer's work, said you claimed it was yours." George felt the blood drain from his face. "That's a lie." The kid nodded quickly. "I know, but they're spreading it like wildfire. Some club owners are starting to listen." George wanted to laugh, wanted to scream, wanted to punch a hole through the nearest wall. But all he did was stand there, gripping his saxophone case, like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Over the next few nights, he started to notice other things. Musicians who had once smiled when he walked into a club now turned their backs. Conversations stopped when he entered the room. Fellow players began showing up late or canceling gigs last minute if they knew he was on the bill. Worse yet, some of them started sabotaging him on stage, playing the wrong keys, throwing off the rhythm, smirking as George tried to hold the pieces together in front of a confused audience. At first, he thought he was imagining it, but it happened again and again and again. He started sleeping less, eating less, staring at the cracked ceiling of his tiny apartment until the first light of morning crept through the window. One night, long after the crowds had gone home, George sat alone at a bar in the Latin Quarter. The bartender wiped down the counter in slow, lazy circles, the air heavy with the scent of old wine and cigarette smoke. George lit a cigarette with shaking hands, watching the smoke curl toward the ceiling. He thought about the first night he had played in Paris, the way the city had felt like it belonged to him for a fleeting moment. And now it felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting for someone to give him that final push. He took another long drag, trying to swallow the rising bitterness. That's when he noticed them again. 3 musicians sitting at the far end of the bar, whispering and laughing quietly. One of them, Henri, the same man who had mocked him before, glanced over and locked eyes with George. Henri didn't flinch, didn't look away. Instead, he leaned in closer to his friends, said something under his breath, and laughed again. George stood slowly, cigarette dangling from his lips, and walked toward them. Every step felt heavier than the last. He stopped just a few feet away, his voice low and steady. "Something funny?" Henri leaned back in his chair, smiling without warmth. "Just conversation, Freeman. You know how it is." George nodded once, his jaw clenched tight. "Yeah," he said. "I know exactly how it is." He turned on his heel and walked out into the cold night air, leaving the laughter behind him. But no matter how far he walked, it followed him, the sound of something breaking. And this time, he wasn't sure he could fix it. The city felt smaller now, tighter. Every street seemed narrower, every shadow longer. George had spent the last few nights walking for hours, taking long detours to avoid familiar places. He didn't want to see the clubs, didn't want to hear the music spilling out of doorways he used to walk through like they belonged to him. He was afraid of what he'd find if he did. But avoiding the city didn't stop the phone from ringing. Pierre had stopped calling. No new gigs, no new offers, nothing but silence where there had once been excitement, praise, and constant invitations. George tried to convince himself it was just a quiet spell. Clubs rotated talent all the time. Maybe they just needed something fresh for a few weeks. Maybe they'd call again next month. But when he showed up at Le Chat Noir on a Friday night, a night he was sure he'd been booked for, his worst fears took shape. He stood outside the club, staring up at the glowing marquee. Tonight, the Laurent Blanche Quartet. No mention of his name. No mention of the American. Just someone else. George pushed his way through the crowded lobby, ignoring the hostess who tried to stop him. He moved past the bar, past the waiting guests, until he found Pierre, standing near the side of the stage, clipboard in hand. "Pierre," George called out, forcing himself to stay calm. Pierre turned, his face tightening the moment he saw him. "George, I didn't expect you tonight." "You booked me 2 weeks ago," George said flatly. "Remember?" Pierre ran a hand through his hair, avoiding George's eyes. "There's been a change in the program." "A change?" George's voice sharpened. "Without telling me?" Pierre sighed. "Look, George, there's been some talk. Some of the local players, they've come to me. They say you've been dominating the stage, not giving them room. They say it's turning people away." George's fists clenched at his sides. "You know that's not true." Pierre shrugged helplessly. I have to keep the peace. The Paris scene is sensitive. If it starts looking like we favor outsiders, I'm not an outsider, George snapped, louder than he meant to. Heads turned. A few people at the bar stopped their conversations. Pierre leaned in, dropping his voice. Look, George, you're good. You're damn good. But Paris belongs to the Parisians. You were never supposed to take the spotlight like this. People are pushing back, hard. I have to listen to them. George took a step back, feeling the air drain from his lungs. So that's it? He asked quietly. After everything, you just dropped me? Pierre looked down at his clipboard, already turning away. I'm sorry. There's nothing I can do. George stood frozen for a long moment. The club, the lights, the music, they all blurred together into a muffled hum. The weight of every choice he had made to come here pressed down on him like a closing fist. He turned and walked out, pushing through the crowd and into the street. He didn't go home that night. Instead, he found himself sitting alone in a tiny cafe on Rue Saint-Honoré, nursing a bitter black coffee that had gone cold hours ago. He lit cigarette after cigarette, staring through the window at the city that had once felt so full of promise. What had he expected? That they would welcome him forever? That the city would forget he was just a guest? He thought about Harlem, about the men who had told him this would happen. Europe's no different, George, they'd warned him. They'll love you until they don't. And here he was, proving them right. He felt the bitterness rising in his throat, choking him. He wanted to fight back, to prove them all wrong. But how could he fight a city that had already decided to shut him out? How could he fight shadows and whispers? He couldn't, and yet, something inside him refused to break. Some small part of him still believed there had to be more than this. He just didn't know where to find it yet. The rain had started to fall softly by the time George reached the left bank. He didn't remember why his feet had carried him here. Only that he couldn't bear to go back to that silent apartment, couldn't face the cracked ceiling and the weight of another night alone. Montmartre felt poisoned now, every corner a reminder of what had been taken from him. So he wandered further, past the familiar clubs, past the streets he had already worn thin with his pacing. He kept walking until the narrow alleys opened onto Boulevard Saint-Germain. The cafes here felt different, quieter, less crowded by the city's constant hunger for reputation and competition. Writers sat in corners with notebooks. Artists hunched over glasses of cheap wine. The air seemed to hum not with noise, but with patience. That's when he heard it. A voice, soft and worn, like honey spilling in candlelight. Not loud, not trying to outshine the room. Just singing. George stopped outside a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a florist. A chalkboard sign stood on the sidewalk, its white letters smeared slightly from the rain. Live tonight, Julie Rousseau. Through the fogged glass window, he could just make out the shape of a woman standing at a piano, her back to the street. The room was dim, the tables half empty. No grand stage, no fancy lights. Just a voice filling the space, like it had nowhere else to go. George pushed the door open slowly, the soft bell above jingling as he stepped inside. He didn't sit, he didn't order a drink. He just stood near the door, listening. Julie Rousseau sang in French. Words George couldn't fully understand, but the melody wrapped around him all the same. Her voice carried something heavier than lyrics, something deeper than language. It carried truth. She finished the song quietly, offering the room a small, almost shy smile before stepping off the low platform. A few people clapped softly. One man dropped a few coins into the tip jar on the piano. George watched as she gathered her sheet music and headed toward the bar. Before he could stop himself, he followed. He waited until she had set her things down and ordered a glass of wine before stepping closer. "Beautiful set," he said softly, careful not to startle her. Julie turned, surprised by his English. She tilted her head slightly, studying him for a moment. "Thank you," she replied in lightly accented English. You speak French? Enough to get lost in it, George replied with a tired smile. Julie chuckled softly. That's the best way to learn. George extended his hand. George Freeman. Her eyes widened slightly in recognition. The American saxophonist? George nodded. That's me. She took his hand gently. Julie Rousseau. For a moment they stood in the quiet hum of the cafe, the world outside the window blurred by rain. Then, without thinking twice, George gestured toward the empty stool beside her. Mind if I sit? They talked until the cafe closed, about music, about the weight of standing on stages that felt too big and too empty at the same time, about the strange loneliness of being heard by so many, yet understood by so few. Julie listened without interruption, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass as George poured out everything. The rumors, the cold shoulders, the feeling of being both celebrated and erased in the same breath. And when he finished, expecting pity or polite dismissal, Julie simply nodded. You don't have to prove anything to them, she said quietly. Not if it costs you. George leaned back, staring at her, unsure of how to respond. She stood, gathering her coat. Come back tomorrow, she added softly. I'll be here again. And he did. Night after night, George returned to that tiny cafe on Saint Germain. Sometimes he played. Sometimes he just listened. Sometimes they sat at the piano together long after the last customer had gone, weaving melodies that belonged to no one else but them. It didn't matter that the rest of the city had turned its back on him. In that dimly lit cafe, with Julie by his side, George found something he hadn't felt in months, something the applause had never given him: peace. George hadn't realized how much noise lived inside him until it finally went quiet. The nights he spent with Julie became the only hours he looked forward to. They didn't feel like work. They didn't feel like survival. They felt like breathing. Sometimes they wrote songs together, slow, aching ballads that belonged to neither New York nor Paris. Sometimes they played for no one but themselves, laughing softly when the notes fell apart, only to rebuild them again. And sometimes they didn't play at all. Sometimes they just were. But as the days stretched into weeks, George began to feel the itch again. It started small, a restless tapping of his foot while Julie rehearsed, a heaviness in his chest when he walked past posters of other musicians filling the clubs he used to play. He told himself it didn't matter. He had something better now, something real. But the hunger never left. He missed the stage, he missed the lights, he missed the way it had felt before the city turned on him. One night, as Julie softly played the piano, George sat by the window of her tiny apartment, staring out at the streets below. He watched strangers pass under the street lamps, their faces turned up toward the starless sky. Their laughter carried on the wind, like a song only they could hear. And suddenly, the walls of that little room felt too close, too small. Julie glanced over her shoulder, sensing the shift. "You're somewhere else tonight," she whispered. George didn't answer at first. He stood slowly, walking toward the window, pressing his hand against the cold glass. "I can't stop thinking about it," he murmured. "About the clubs?" Julie asked gently. "About all of it," George replied. "About New York, about Paris, about where I actually belong." Julie closed the piano softly, turning to face him. "Do you really think you'll find that on a stage?" George turned to her, frustration flashing in his eyes. "That's all I've ever known, Julie. The music, the crowd, the noise. It's the only place I've ever felt enough." Julie stood slowly, walking toward him. "Enough for who, George? Them or you?" The question cut deeper than he wanted to admit, because he didn't know the answer. He had spent so long chasing validation that he didn't remember what it felt like to play just for himself. The applause had always felt like survival. But now, standing in front of the only person who had never asked him to be anything other than who he was, George realized something terrifying. he didn't know how to stop chasing it. The call came the next morning. Pierre. George almost didn't pick up, but when he did, Pierre's voice sounded different. Tense. Rushed. "George, listen," Pierre said quickly. "The European Jazz Festival is next month, the biggest stage in Europe. They're putting together the lineup now, and they want you to headline." George gripped the phone tighter, his heart pounding. "After everything, why?" Pierre sighed. "Because you're still the best they've got. The noise has quieted down. The city loves a comeback. And this is your shot to take it all back." George didn't answer right away. He glanced across the room at Julie, who stood silently, waiting for him to speak. Pierre's voice softened. "Think about it, George. You know where to find me." The line went dead. For the rest of the day, George barely spoke. He wandered through the city with Julie at his side, both of them knowing something had shifted, even if they didn't say it out loud. That night, as they stood on the bridge overlooking the Seine, Julie finally broke the silence. "You're going to take it, aren't you?" she whispered. George looked down at the dark water below, his reflection fractured by ripples. "I don't know," he admitted. Julie took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Then let me ask you something." George turned to her, his breath catching in his throat. "Do it for you this time," she whispered. "Not for them, not for the crowd, not for revenge. Do it because you still love it." George swallowed hard, feeling the words settle in his chest like a weight he wasn't sure he could carry. But for the first time, he knew what he had to do. The city buzzed with rumors for weeks leading up to the festival. George heard them everywhere, in cafes, on street corners, even in whispered conversations in the market. Some said he was finished. Others claimed he was planning the greatest comeback Paris had ever seen. Every version of the story seemed to grow larger, more exaggerated with every retelling. But George ignored them. For the first time in months, he didn't care what anyone else had to say. He cared about the music. Julie stood by his side every step of the way. They rehearsed together in her apartment, late into the nights when the city had long since fallen silent. Julie played the piano softly, guiding George back to the reason he had fallen in love with music in the first place. Not for the stage, not for the applause, but for the way it filled the spaces inside him that nothing else could touch. And when the night before the festival finally arrived, George stood by the window of her apartment, staring out at the sleeping city below. "You ready?" Julie whispered from behind him. George turned, smiling softly. "I've never been more ready in my life." The festival grounds stretched along the banks of the Seine, just outside the city limits. A massive white tent stood like a beacon against the darkening sky, glowing from within as the crowds poured in. Backstage, George could feel the tension in the air. Musicians tuning their instruments, managers barking orders, journalists flashing cameras. It should have made him nervous, but it didn't. He was calm, focused, alive. Pierre found him just before the show, holding a program in his hands. "George," he said breathlessly, "they're all here tonight. Every critic, every promoter. This is your night. You have to take it." George looked at him, almost feeling sorry for how desperate he sounded. "I'm not here to take anything, Pierre," George replied softly. "I'm here to give something." Pierre blinked, caught off guard, but said nothing more as George walked toward the stage. The tent was packed, hundreds of faces, all waiting. George stepped into the light, the weight of his saxophone familiar in his hands. He didn't look for approval. He didn't search the crowd for familiar faces. He just closed his eyes and played. The music started low, like a whisper carried on the wind, a soft melody that curled around the edges of the tent, pulling the audience in closer with every note. And then he let go. George played like he had never played before, not for fame, not for revenge, but for the love of the sound itself. Every breath, every note, every rise and fall of the melody felt like peeling away the layers he had spent years building around himself. The crowd leaned in, holding their breath, as if afraid to break the spell. And when the final note hung in the air, trembling like the last heartbeat of a dying star, the tent erupted. Applause thundered through the night. People rose to their feet. Strangers shouted his name. George stood there, chest heaving, staring out at the sea of faces. For a moment, he felt weightless. But as he stepped off the stage, reality crashed back down around him. Pierre was waiting, holding a newspaper, his face pale. George frowned. What now? Pierre swallowed hard, holding out the paper. George took it, his eyes scanning the headline. The American fraud? Paris musicians accuse George Freeman of stealing the spotlight at Europe's biggest jazz stage. The article tore through him like glass. Anonymous quotes, wild accusations, and thinly veiled insults dressed up as journalism. George felt the blood drain from his face. His hands trembled. Not again. Not again. Pierre tried to speak, but George didn't hear him. The applause from inside the tent had already faded, and all George could hear now was the silence. He didn't remember walking away from the tent, didn't remember crossing the festival grounds, pushing through the crowds, ignoring the people who tried to call after him. The newspaper felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in his hands. He crumpled it without thinking, stuffing it into the nearest trash bin as if that might somehow erase what had just been done to him. But the words had already carved themselves into his mind. Fraud, thief, not one of us. By the time George reached the edge of Paris, the city had gone quiet again. The sky hung heavy with clouds, the air thick with the promise of rain. The streets he had once walked with excitement now felt like empty corridors in someone else's house. And for the first time in years, George wondered if he had made a mistake coming here at all. He wandered without direction, without purpose, until he found himself in front of Julie's apartment. The light in her window was still on. He climbed the stairs slowly, every step heavier than the last. When she opened the door, she didn't say a word. She just stepped aside and let him in. The apartment felt too small now, too quiet. George stood in the center of the room, staring at nothing, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. They did it again, he whispered, his voice cracking. They turned on me again. Julie crossed the room, her face pale with worry. I know, she whispered. I saw it. I tried to stop them. George spun toward her, his voice sharper than he intended. Why? What's the point? You can't stop them. You can't. Julie flinched, hurt flickering in her eyes. You're not listening. I am listening, George snapped, pacing the floor. I've been listening since the day I got here. And do you know what I hear? The same thing I heard back in New York. No matter what I do, no matter how well I play, I'm still the outsider. I'm still the threat. Julie took a shaky breath. Then stop letting them define you, George. Stop believing them. He stopped, staring at her, chest heaving. And what? Just pretend it doesn't matter? Pretend this city didn't chew me up and spit me out like every other place I've ever been? Julie shook her head slowly, stepping closer. No. Build something they can't take from you. George let out a bitter laugh. And what's that supposed to be? Julie didn't back down. She reached for his hand. Her voice steady. Something that belongs to you, George. Not to them. Not to their stages. Not to their approval. To you. George stared at her, the weight of her words settling like a stone in his gut. He pulled his hand away, running it through his hair as he turned toward the window. I don't even know where to start, he whispered. Julie took a step closer, resting her hand on his shoulder. Start with the thing they can't touch, she whispered. The music. But George couldn't answer. Not yet. That night he left Julie's apartment and walked the empty streets of Montmartre until the sun began to rise. He stood at the top of the hill, looking out over the city as it stretched beneath the pale morning sky. He thought about every stage he had played, every lie he had heard, every time he had let someone else decide his worth. And somewhere in the quiet, a stubborn thought began to form, a thought he had never allowed himself to believe. What if he didn't need their permission anymore? What if the life he had been chasing was never theirs to give in the first place? The city didn't feel like a promise anymore. But maybe, just maybe, it didn't have to. The next day passed in a haze. George didn't leave his apartment. He didn't touch his saxophone. He didn't answer Julie's knocks at the door. He just sat by the window, watching the city live without him. He lit cigarette after cigarette until the ashtray overflowed. The walls felt like they were pressing in on him, as if the whole world had shrunk to the size of this one tiny room. Every voice in his head sounded like one of them. You don't belong here. You were never one of us. They only wanted your music, not you. He leaned his forehead against the cold window glass and closed his eyes, his breath fogging up the glass as he whispered to the empty room. Maybe they're right. But then, somewhere in that silence, another voice rose up. Not one of them, not one from New York, not even Julie. It was his own, small, quiet, but alive. What if they're wrong? That night, George finally left his apartment. He walked for hours until he found himself in the same place where he had landed all those months ago, on the steps of Sacré-Cœur, looking out over the sleeping city. He sat down heavily, his saxophone case resting beside him. For the first time in weeks, he opened it, running his fingers over the cool metal. It felt heavier now, not because of its weight, but because of everything it carried. Years of hope, years of rejection, years of trying to prove he belonged. He closed his eyes and remembered the faces back home, the old men who taught him how to breathe life into a melody, the women who stood in the back of smoky clubs swaying softly to his music, the children who watched him with wide eyes, believing for just a moment that music could take them somewhere better. He had left all of that behind, chasing something he couldn't even name. And here he was, realizing that maybe he hadn't needed to. When he stood up again, the city looked different. Not smaller, not colder, just clearer. George walked down the hill, past the cafes and bookstores, past the clubs where his face had once hung on every poster. He stopped in front of a narrow alley, barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side. Tucked between two shuttered shops was a small, empty space with dusty windows and a crooked door. He stood there for a long time, staring at it. It wasn't much. It wasn't grand. But it was something real. A place no one had claimed yet. A place where he could build something of his own. Not for Paris, not for New York, not for anyone but the music itself. That night, George went back to Julie. She opened the door, eyes filled with the kind of worry that had been growing for days. But before she could say anything, George reached for her hand. "I want to build something," he whispered. "Not for them, not for the crowd. For us, for everyone like us who's tired of waiting for permission to belong." Julie's eyes filled with tears, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Where do we start?" George smiled for the first time in days. "I've got a place in mind." And for the first time since stepping off that boat, George Freeman finally knew where he was going. The space was nothing more than a forgotten basement, squeezed between an old bookstore and a shuttered flower shop. The air smelled of damp stone and dust. Cracks zigzagged across the ceiling like scars. George stood in the doorway, looking around in silence. Julie stood beside him, arms crossed, her face caught somewhere between disbelief and hope. "This is it?" she whispered. George nodded slowly. "This is it." It took weeks to clean it out. They scrubbed the walls, patched the floor, and hauled out piles of broken furniture. Friends began to show up, musicians George had met in back rooms, in alleyways, on stages he no longer played. Word spread quickly. George Freeman's building something of his own. They came with paintbrushes, with tools, with ideas. Some brought nothing but their hands and their time, but they all stayed. It didn't matter that the ceiling still leaked when it rained. It didn't matter that the wiring was old and the lights flickered sometimes. It mattered that it was theirs. When the space was finally ready, George stood in the center of the empty floor and took a deep breath. No velvet curtains, No gold-trimmed posters, no headlines. Just a bare stage, a single microphone, and a row of mismatched chairs. He called it l'atelier, the workshop. The first night, only a handful of people showed up. George didn't care. He took the stage, lifted his saxophone, and let the music pour out of him like it had been waiting there his whole life. Julie joined him on the piano, her voice filling the tiny room like sunlight breaking through a storm. And by the end of the night, the room was full, not just with people, but with something heavier, something truer. Belonging. L'Atelier grew faster than George expected. Word spread through the streets of Paris. Not through critics or managers, but through the mouths of musicians who had spent too long waiting for someone to let them in. People came from everywhere, young artists with nothing but a borrowed guitar, old jazzmen carrying the weight of 100 empty promises, singers, poets, drummers, pianists, each one stepping onto that tiny stage without fear of being too much or not enough. At L'Atelier, no one had to prove they belonged. They just did. And George played every night. Not for fame, not for redemption, not to silence the voices that had tried to break him, but for the love of the music, the only thing that had ever truly been his. Years later, people would tell stories about that place, about the tiny basement that became the heartbeat of a city, about the American who built a home in the one place that tried to push him out. And when they asked George why he had done it, why he hadn't left when they gave him every reason to, he always gave the same answer. Because they didn't get to decide where my story ends. The end.